everyone, and welcome to the Raising Rices podcast. We have a fascinating and very countercultural conversation to have with you guys today.
Yeah, and I am excited to kind of maybe reveal our position here a little bit. It's not a popular one.
No, but it's definitely a conversation that, at the very least, should be had with your spouse, whether or not you align with us on this position.
Yeah, again, remember all of our conversations here, we are sharing our convictions. And in this case, I think we have some biblical argument for the main point of our conviction. But when it comes to the actual working out of the details, I guess that there's probably some just personalness to the conviction. So bear it with us with a grain of salt. And I think, like Marissa's saying, at least consider if this is um, like how you would apply this in your home. Are you and your spouse aligned? And are you being intentional about this? Because, like with so many things we talk about, it's really easy to let the popular view slip in or to take the position that you have no stance, which really in itself is a stance. So consider carefully as we talk about this today.
Okay, so we have kind of two parts to this conversation, which means this podcast either is going to get split into two or it might be a little longer podcast because I think there is definitely some like you need to like wade through the forest to actually get to the conclusion or the conviction. And here on the Raising Rices podcast, we always talk about our convictions and how from that conviction there are definitely character developments that happen from it, but there also are challenges. And so we're going to kind of like wade through both of those. So, in light of that, I want to tell you a story about how we arrived at this conversation between Darren and I. And we actually do enjoy listening to podcasts, to interviews, books on tape. Tape, oh my goodness, how old am I? But we were listening to a podcast from a gentleman called, his name is Jeremy Pryor. And if you haven't heard of him, he's a very thought provoking gentleman, very, very focused on family teams. And so that's something that Darren and I are passionate about as well. And so it's fun to kind of hear his thoughts. Well, he
Yeah.
was, oh, go
Oh, I
ahead.
was just
No,
saying, I
go
think
ahead.
it's cool on a few takes because one, you don't have to align theologically on every single point to really glean some wise insight on various topics from different people. And I think you'd be careful. We don't typically look outside of like Christian orthodoxy for those insights, but in this case, like for example, I took a course and he was talking about home church and his perspective on it and my perspective on it, like they don't really come together, but that's like an ecclesiastical issue. But when it comes to matters of the family sphere of authority, there's a lot of really great wisdom. So I think it's interesting. Like take everything in with a grain of salt. Make sure you're within Christian orthodoxy, but yeah, a really great
Yeah,
influence.
we really enjoy his podcast because, like Darren said, even if we don't align 100%, it gets the conversation going. And I think
Big
that's
time.
something he would be totally 100% on board with is having these conversations, thinking through these thoughts. Okay, now that we've laid that groundwork. So on his podcast, he brings his wife in and other people to like talk about different cultural things that are happening. He'll even play clips from other podcast interviews, TikTok, whatever. And the one that we heard that got us really chatting, and we've been chatting about this for a while, Darren and I. So we're really excited to bring it to you guys here on the Raising Rices podcast. Is they introed with this Chinese
Yeah.
gal who
Yeah.
was being interviewed, and she was kind of fired up. She was kind
He's
of
just almost angry.
angry
Yeah.
at her parents, and we're like, whoa, what's going on? So she was saying that, due to the lack of children, that were allowed to
Right.
be born for many, many years, they are facing this horrible deficit where they don't have what they need to replace the next generation. I'm sure you've heard of this before. However, this new perspective was quite interesting because she was, like Darren said, mad, angry. She said
Yeah.
my parents raised me to be Mulan, raised me to be a warrior, to be the best in the class, to be a leader, courageous and brave, and to go out into the world and conquer. That is what they created me to be. And now they want me to stay home, have babies, be meek and mild and gentle, you know?
Yeah.
And she was like, "You didn't raise me to be that, though." And so that kind of is where this conversation starts.
Yeah. I mean, you wrote to consider the trajectory that you're putting your kids on, right? And in that setting, families would have one child and they were treating every child like a son. And that's really where she ended up being. And then now they go role reversal on her and they say, wait a minute, we want you to be something else we didn't raise you to be. And so I think as parents, we have to consider this idea of who are we raising our kids to be. And that's a lot of what we talk about here is what are those traits of biblical manhood, biblical womanhood that we're seeking to enact in our own lives? And how are we thinking about our family dynamic and parenting our children and disciplining our children and discipling our children in ways that are honoring to God? And I was thinking it back, like Marissa mentioned, it's a new conversation, but we've been talking about it actually for a while. And that is just that, just thinking back, like way back, I remember listening to Vadi Bakum talk about this
Yeah.
and kind of some of the second part of it that I think we're hopefully going to get to in this episode or the next, which is a spiritual element of who we're raising our children to be and kind of what those dynamics look like as they transition from childhood into adulthood.
So it was so interesting. One of the things that Darren and I specifically pulled out from this conversation, this podcast, this interview, was that we actually are raising daughters differently than sons. And very timely, I posted a reel on Instagram and it had absolutely nothing to do with gender. It was
But yet you got all the hate.
I got all the hate. It was simply showing some of the benefits that our family has found from homeschooling. And so a quick little snippets of pictures. Our son is like driving the tractor. Our
You
daughter,
you literally just went through your camera roll
yeah,
and just like, what did everybody do in the last week and a half?
yeah,
And just like pulled the last video clip you had of each kid. Like this was not planned. This
no,
was just the way that
it came out.
we live, the way that our children live, whatever.
Yeah, and like our son was driving the tractor, our daughter was making a cake, our other son was changing the tires on a new truck. Like it was like Darren said, literally just what we've done that week. And like newsflash, our daughter also drives the tractor too.
Right.
Like we're not saying that we haven't taught them skills in these different departments, but that is just what I had and I posted it. And the feedback about you should be raising your daughters the same as sons. You should be teaching your sons the same as daughters. It was just like, wow, there is, you know it, but there is such a, severe cultural influence to the point where, these cyber computer keyboard warriors feel like they need to indicate to you what you are doing wrong. Society.
Right. Yeah. The claims or the accusations of sexism
Yes.
came flying out of the woodwork at you because how dare you, have your daughter learning how to cook in the kitchen and your boys working out in, I don't remember what season it was, the hot or the cold or whatever. And the funny thing is yeah, the boys, they know a little bit of how to bake and how to cook.
Mm-hmm.
And the girls, like Madeline, knows how to drive the tractor. But if you give them the choice,
Yeah.
I was outside working today, and the boys just naturally gravitate towards like, "Hey, what's dad doing? Maybe I can help him." And then I get to teach and talk about like what we're doing and why we're doing it and how to kind of innovate and make things work with what you have or whatever. And it just is part of the way that we live. And so we're thinking about this conversation about who are you raising your kids to be? And then we really have to ask ourselves, like, biblically, what is the frame that we need to raise our kids under?
Right. And as we get into our part two of this conversation, I'm just going to give you kind of like a pre little, like, oh, I can see where they're going with this. What we're going to be talking about is as we prepare our children, our boys and our girls, for specific God given roles as they mature and, Lord willing, get married, there is equally a concern that society has that you need to equip both men and women to fulfill both roles.
Because we live such an individualistic
Right.
society, right? What is the divorce rate in the United States? Like I've heard everything from 40 to 50%.
I even heard 60, so
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Maybe it's coming down a little bit now from what it was for a brief time, but it's high. And so we live our lives as youth individualistically, and then we prepare to launch into adulthood as individuals, and then we get married planning on probably being individual or likely being an individual again. And so our whole society is founded around kind of those ideas that you're saying. Is like, well, you need to teach to do that, you need to teach them exactly the same to do all the same things. And so maybe at this point we should like figure out if there's a good way to state our actual conviction.
When I was thinking about this, I was saying, since the conversation gears around females, gears around daughters, this one today, that my conviction would be that I am raising my daughters different than my sons.
What?
I know. Here comes the tomatoes thrown at my face. And I say this because that is not a popular statement. That is not a popular conversation to have. But I don't know how you can argue with that truth if you have a biblical mindset.
Right. Yeah. So, okay. So you make that statement, and somebody might squirm at it a little bit to start, and then they can qualify some things and say, like, yeah, but, you're at least going to give them like the same education, and you're going to give them the same, um, the same responsibility when they turn 18. And, I don't know what some others are. Like, we can say that, but then we can equalize it quite a bit, right?
I mean, I just think about this. We are all equal in value, but we are different in role.
Amen.
And so I can understand where people are coming from when they are trying to equalize it, right? When they're trying to make sure that both genders see their value, and they are finding their value in the external, like in what they are being taught,
What they're able to
what
do.
they're able to do, the roles that they will fulfill need to be equal.
We talked about this when it comes to success.
Yes.
Like, how do you define success? And we've talked about it in the context of the family. But here we have to consider how we define it in the context of the individual. How do you define success for your kids? And one of the things here, I'm just like tangenting. We may have shared with you a little bit, and we're like preparing to share in more detail on the podcast with you. We've been having focused discipleship time with the boys and the girls. And one of the things that stood out in the first book the boys are reading together is that they're talking about the author of the book has this kind of like catechism that he says with the boys. And he says, what do men do? And he says, well, men protect and provide. And then he says, who was the perfect man? And Jesus Christ is the answer. And so it just reminds me of that, like there is equal value, but different roles. Because you wouldn't say, what do women do? Protect and provide. Because that is not a biblical picture of what a woman does.
And yet we can, in today's culture, use similar verbiage where we could say, well, provide, they're providing nurturing, right? Well, I think that we're blending or using the word to define different terms.
Right.
Right. So when I bring up conversations like we are equal in value, different in role, I think that the red flags come up is when I use specific words to encourage one gender or another. Here's another example. I want both my sons and my daughters to be courageous.
Sure.
I think that in previous podcasts, we've really dove deep into this, so I won't get into it too much, but that looks different because of their gender
Right.
in the ways that it plays out. And again, feel free to listen to some other podcasts to see. But all this to say, coming back to the parenting, because we do like to focus here on the Raising Rices podcast about raising households that serve the Lord. And so, how does teaching and preparing our daughters differently than our sons help households serve the Lord? And I think that the word household is very important because I think that we, like Darren mentioned, only think single track,
Right.
individualistic. But really, we are a family team. We are a community. And one of the interesting things that have come up in the social media world is we went through this phase where the girl boss was very popular. Everyone wanted to be a girl
Oh,
boss,
yeah.
make all the money, do all the
Own the
things, and
business.
retire their husband. I
Right.
mean, if you haven't heard about this, good on you because you haven't been in social media then.
Way to avoid it.
Way to avoid it. And now this year, the next term that has been exploding out of thin air, what it feels like,
Yeah.
is the trad wife. And ironically, the trad wife is displaying traditional roles.
Yeah.
So it's not really a new phenomenon. It's just actually being talked about because we've swayed so far with the pendulum to the other side.
Right. Yeah. It's a return to a traditional value and a traditional ethic. And it's gaining in popularity, interestingly, both in Christian and non-Christian circles.
Right.
Which is where I think some of the objection, and we'll get to this when we talk to challenges, where there's some objections to some of the philosophy of what we're going to share as far as how we're parenting our girls specifically along the way. So as we parent our girls, we have to be considering when we look at, and we've done a podcast on this before, but when we look at biblical womanhood and the focus of the direction that we're pointing our girls in, now we have to really consider how are we raising them so that we point them into that direction. And it can be as, I mean, you mentioned like Mulan earlier, and I didn't grow up on Disney. I don't know kind of that story even in depth.
That's supposed to be a fable or a
Right, like a
cultural,
historical,
yeah.
but
Even if you don't watch Disney, you might know the story.
but I just think even in the context of just children's literature
Right.
or children's movies, you have to consider strongly what message that or what worldview those literature, those inputs are portraying.
Very, very important what is inputs are coming into you and what inputs are coming into your children, but also take note of the outputs of your conversation. Are you uplifting the biblical role of wife, of mother? Or is that something to be brushed to the side and focus on boss, girl boss, or one of the things that a friend was mentioning is that excuse me, we just mentioned it with the Mulan too, but I want to just really hone in to this for a moment, is that we listen to stories. There's so many stories that are being played out. And so what is the story that you're portraying, that you're
Hmm.
elevating, and that you are, championing? Because that story is going to be the internal thoughts of your children and of you ultimately.
So it's really a sanctifying journey of yourself
Right.
to be having your right mind as a mom, right? Have your right mind in Christ, to have the right mindset over the parenting and the role that you have in the home, and then portraying the blessing of that, and even explicitly sharing the blessing of that with your daughters specifically as they grow up.
Right. And coming back into that interview where that gal said, "You raised me to be Mulan. Now you want me to be a mother." It seems like they're trying to change the trajectory once the daughter was 18, once the interviewer was 18, where you are laying the foundation, the framework, all up when your girls are young, specifically talking about girls right now, and also obviously for sons. But you are laying the groundwork then. We need to remember that if we're not talking about these things, we're not uplifting them, we're not showing the value, then when they're 18 and we're like, okay, now go get married and have babies, they're like, no, no, no.
Yeah, yeah,
You said all these things were more important in your actions when I was growing up.
right. Or I saw what, yeah, I saw, all I saw was you complain about how much work it was to homeschool, or how much work it was to be at home, or complain about how dad, was always gone working, and wasn't, didn't share the responsibility at home, or
Right.
whatever those little pieces are. So what are some really practical things that you hear, either on the positive or the negative side, that you think are the big guiding places in this trajectory? Maybe as your girls are like even 5 up through, 15.
Right. I will tell a quick story that will lead into more specific examples, but I can just hear the inner thoughts right now, but oh, they are indoctrinating their children.
Yes.
And well, everyone is indoctrinated by
Oh,
something,
yeah.
right? Is influenced by something. And I grew up in an era that was influenced by not only the Christian church, but also society at large, to say that everyone needed to go to college.
It was
It
huge.
was huge, it was the standard.
Yeah. Like
And
early
so,
2000s, late 90s.
yeah, when you
Yeah.
graduated high school, that is what you did. You went to college and then you graduated college with all this debt, most likely. And
Yep.
then you went into the workforce to pay off the debt. And because you felt guilt if you did not use the degree that you spent all this money and are still paying off to
Right.
do.
Yeah.
And
Or I mean, or you are not able to pay off the debt, and you still have this guilt and all the debt,
right,
and sometimes not even able to put it to practical use. But
right. So just when I give practical ideas about ways that I want to raise my daughter, I want to remember that it is very important to me to, one, be biblical. I like to talk about be countercultural, but really more importantly, I want to be biblical in
right.
my thoughts. And so I'm going to look to the Bible, and specifically to Titus 2, where it gives the older women instruction for the younger women. And I can see in this passage how the older women are directing maybe younger women who are already married or already have children, because of some of the verbiage, like be a worker at home and to love your husband and your children. However, as we mentioned earlier, you're setting the trajectory, like Darren said, maybe like 5 or 6. We're
Right.
not trying to like change the momentum all of a sudden when they're 18. We're trying to start that now. So, thinking in my head, what have I learned as a mom? And what has the Lord been impressing on me to move forward in, that are like to shake off and to put on
Right.
through scripture? Things like standards of we mentioned baking earlier are awesome and they're fun being, knowing how to do all these things. But what is the heart of that? To me, hospitality
Right.
is the heart of why I enjoy now baking and cooking and setting the table. And that's because my love for the people that I'm serving is coming out through my hospitality. It also says in the Bible that, to be an elder at a church, one of the qualifications is that the family, because I view it as a whole family team, is hospitable.
Right.
And so I think that that's a very important element. But under that one title of hospitality, there is so many little facets, right? Like that's the theme, but there's so many elements that go into it to help you learn how to be hospitable.
Right. And so what you're really saying just in that one little piece, and that's just one character
Right.
trait, right?
Right.
So this is just one character trait, but think about the difference in the mentality if you're raising an individualistic girl boss to be, power forward, accomplish their individual goals, or if you're raising a girl to be hospitable and to in that way like care for the home and to be hospitable both to the body of Christ and in evangelism
Mhm.
to their neighbors in that setting. Like that's such a different trajectory of where you're putting your focus and your energy.
And where you're putting your value. Because I was just talking to a friend the other day. She went to visit another friend, and both her friend and the husband of her friend work full time, make great money. They've been very blessed in that. And so, in turn, they have purchased properties and vacation rentals and whatnot. And uh, the jealousy, started rising. And I was like, oh, that would be so cool.
Yeah, how
But
awesome.
how awesome, right? But then I said, what would I have to give up
Right.
in order to obtain that? And the truth is, I would have to give up my time at home because we're all only given such a certain amount of time. And my time homeschooling, my time homemaking, my time developing relationships and serving others, like Darren said, in the body and evangelism, like those things would have to be compromised. Not to say that you cannot disciple your children if you do work. I think I've seen other people do it for sure. I think it's harder.
Well, just the amount of time that you
Right.
have available is less.
Yeah.
Like you would literally subtract 30, 40 plus hours a week out of what you do right now.
Right.
And then you end up also having to pay somebody else to at least keep your kids alive those 40 hours a week, let alone if you want to pay them extra to, train them with your same worldview.
Right.
So there's a huge trade-off. And then even if you all go your separate ways, like say you made a lot of extra money and you sent all your kids to a Christian school, like a classical Christian education, which I think is a good thing, you still have to play in the fact that all of a sudden everybody's going different directions
Mhm.
and you've decentralized the home a little bit. And so I would advocate that unless you're able to also then be heavily involved in that Christian school, whether as a teacher or a deacon or a principal or whatever kind of role you would have there, that you have to really consider, are you fragmenting your family in too many directions?
Right. And with any kind of school setting, you run that cultural influence of being the best in class, being, and hear me out. I do think it's really important that we bring our best gift forward to the Lord. Like I don't think that we should do anything not wholeheartedly, right? Like we
Right.
should do all for the glory of God. I don't think you should be lazy or sluggardish when it comes to learning and education. But the priority given to, I guess, what you're trying to obtain from that
Right. Yeah,
education.
so take education just for a moment. You brought up The element that in the area you were raised in, inside and outside the church, it was kind of the expectation that if you wanted to be successful or make something of yourself, you were going to go to college. And but then staying in the same moment. Our view is not, and I think sometimes it gets misconstrued this way.
Mhm.
The view is not to raise dumb women,
Right.
right?
Yes, and
So,
amen.
so this is not, well, our daughters don't deserve a higher education, or this is not, our daughters don't deserve any education. And it's definitely not limiting, like, well, they're just going to learn to read and write and have an eighth grade education, and then they need to, toil in the home. No,
No.
absolutely not. But like you said, it's the focus and the goal of the outcome of that education.
Mhm.
And so is the focus and the goal to manage their house well. Like you think of a Proverbs 31 woman, and a
Right.
lot of times that's taken to be a support text for the girl boss, like the Christian breadwinning woman. But really, that passage describes a woman who manages her home well so that her husband can work and protect and provide, and she manages well what he provides for the family. And it takes smarts and it takes education, but it's like you said, where's the focus of the
Right.
education? Is the focus bent towards that, or is the focus bent towards a career in mechanical engineering?
Right. And this goes for sons too. Like, what is the focus of their education?
Sure.
Darren, I think you've shared the story in the podcast before. If we haven't, here's the new story of background about Darren. He was going to go to school to learn how to make
Yeah,
guitars.
trade school. I really wanted to go to trade school. Tons of money out of pocket, months away in another state, or a year and a half, I don't remember, to be a luthier, to make guitars, right? But the practicality of that was just so poor. And so then I figured I was a halfway decent musician and that maybe I could have a career in music somewhere. And I took a class called Careers in Music, and I realized that every musician ends up like sleeping on the couch in their like music studio eating top ramen, and and they can't support a family, or the vast majority, right? And so
The 99%.
yeah, and so all of a sudden like you were mentioning, to your point,
Hmm.
the focus of the
Right.
education. What was the focus of the education? Not to do something fun for 4 years, not to, pursue every passion and every dream, but to gain an education in a trade or in a professionalism that allowed a legitimate way to provide for a family,
Because biblical men.
protect and provide. And so just the that was the catalyst. Now then you take the catalyst and you pair it together with some passions and some natural skills and those types of things, and you end up in a vocation that hopefully does well for you and your family. But do you see, as you're listening to this, the focus is different, the goal, the outcome. So again, how you're determining success, that's where the difference, I think, is.
Right. And I think this is a good caveat into the second part that we've been dying to talk about, is that when we were in that era of college and education, specifically your worth was if you had credentials. I think that we heard the story that you need these credentials as women as your fallback plan. Even if you want to get married, even if you want to be a stay-at-home mom, because that was my goal, is to get married and be a stay-at-home mom. Well, that's fine, but you still need this college education, or you still need credentials X, Y, and Z, so that in case anything could happen after you get married, or if your husband dies or divorce or breaks his legs and needs you to, work. I don't know. You just need a backup plan.
Right.
And I think that as we have been talking more, Darren and I, about raising daughters differently than
Hmm.
sons, we are recognizing that if we require our daughters to be basically living two lives, right?
Yeah, like,
Like,
yeah,
go ahead.
both be raised in a traditional biblical sense of desire of their hearts, and be raised to be able to be a man if they need to be.
Right. We are pulling our daughters in two different directions and requiring things of them that are actually not obtainable.
Right.
You cannot serve two masters.
Yeah, and so to bring this point, and this is where you hit that objection with the trad wife movement
Right. This is
on
the
social media
challenge.
right now. This is the challenge. This is the objection. Is I can't believe that you're putting all your trust and all of your eggs in the basket of one husband who provides for you.
How ironic that statement, putting all your eggs in one basket as a trad wife.
Yes.
But it's so true, like saying, I am all in.
Right.
I do not have a backup plan. I do not have an expectation of leaving, of working, of making my own way and trajectory.
Right.
And the bottom line we've navigated as we've talked about it, and I would love you to consider this with
Because
us.
it seems like a legitimate concern in the world we
Right.
live in today. It seems like a legitimate argument, but we have to consider our where our hope is or what our backup plan
Right.
is.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think one trajectory leads you to the fear of man, and one trajectory leads you to the fear of the Lord. Because if you are moving down the path of biblical womanhood and you are saying, I want what the Bible has for me, I want what the Lord speaks highly of for women, and I'm going to be all in for that, then I am going to trust that as I pursue that, that the Lord will take care of me.
Wait, so your backup plan isn't based in the wisdom or the fear of man?
No, the fear of the Lord. But if I do operate in having a backup plan, in my just in case, I am taking those cards and I am holding them tightly and I am not giving them to the Lord.
Right.
I say that I can take care of myself and this is how I'm going to do it. I'm a very I focused trajectory, and that interferes and impedes with the family dynamic.
Right.
And speaking of the family dynamic, I think that young women feel this more severely when they do not have a family who has explicitly expressed that they have their back no matter what.
Right. So it's not that there's no consideration of wisdom. I think there should be consideration of just general wisdom, wise principles applied. I don't think we should live recklessly. I think we all agree that. But the practicality of, like you said, serving two masters or where your backup plan lies has to be really strongly considered. And I think it's appropriate to consider it in the context that God has already laid out in the family. And I think that goes both in a physical aspect and in a spiritual aspect. And so we have to consider that the way that we're raising our daughters again impacts not just them, but then also impacts the home. And so that's where instead of saying you need a backup plan, we say you are part of this family.
Mhm.
And especially as a daughter, especially as a young woman, we are both your physical provision as a father and your spiritual head as a father for until you go under the headship of another man. Now, that is tremendously unpopular to say, I'm sure.
Yes. And if that headship of that man was to somehow be taken away, like death or divorce
Right.
or what have you, then we believe our conviction lies that our Darren, as the head of this family, will bring back into the fold the daughter
Right.
and children or
I mean,
whoever.
of course. Well, okay, yes. Yes, of course. But I want to say part of that couples with and pairs together that in the process, hopefully, as we've recently talked about, of picking a spouse, that we are training our daughters to choose a Christian man.
Hmm.
And then, secondly, that the relationship between the father, myself, and the future son in law is such that there is counseling and encouragement and um, promotion of the marriage of those two people together
Right.
first. And then when they prove themselves to be an unbeliever or there's a tragedy that happens, then the father steps back in as the head
Right.
and back in as the provider and the protector.
And I
Because it's
we definitely want to do a podcast about dealing with divorce or turmoil
yeah,
within another couple. And we will get to that. So it's like one of those comments where like, don't hear what I'm not saying,
yeah, like
like,
that's just like this tiniest
yeah,
little glimpse of a huge conversation that we should probably cover
yeah,
when it comes to just like what we're teaching our kids about divorce, because divorce happens in the world all around us.
yes,
And if you're preaching through the Bible, you're preaching about divorce, and so it all comes up, and it's pertinent conversation.
right,
But tiny glimpse, side note, my main point being that the father, myself, should not inappropriately step in to rescue the daughter when there is still marriage restoration of that future marriage to happen.
and we
That's
did,
my biggest
yeah, we
concern.
did talk about this on a previous podcast that we always want to be as an integrated family, that we are the support system to one another, but there is a biblical precedent to making sure the husband and wife are in a strong union
Right.
as a family.
Yeah, that has to come like primary,
Right.
right? Each individual's relationship with God, the husband's relationship with the wife, and then as brothers and sisters in Christ and blood relations, the family.
Right. And these are so huge topics, and these are very misconstrued by the society that we live in.
Yeah.
And so, in us covering this, make sure that you do listen to some of our other content, or always message us if you have any questions. Consult your own pastor and your own elders too for biblical wisdom and
Right.
guidance when it comes to these sensitive topics. But ultimately, bottom line, the contingency plan for our daughters is Darren.
Right.
And this got brought up too. If Darren is not around, let's say our daughters are older and something has happened.
Yeah. Yeah, it's frequent, right?
Right.
Like that even after years of marriage and even raising children, that then something, you're in your 50s, 60s, something unexpected, but you're not old enough to really retire. Something unexpected happens to the husband or a marriage falls apart, unfortunately, at that point in time. And like with our youngest, I could be 60, 70, 80, I don't know.
That was like
Maybe not that old.
30 years that you covered there.
65, I don't know, older. So your point being,
My point
if
being,
the
yeah.
if the father, or say there's a series of family tragedies, if the father cannot provide, this is where we're parenting both our sons and our daughters, that it is reasonable and expected that our sons would step in to also provide for their sisters who are in need.
Yes. So, wow. This was a big, weighty topic that I feel like we only scratched the surface at. So, I think what I would like
In
to,
45
I
minutes.
know, I think the things that I would encourage any listener right now to bring back to their spouse to bring back to have conversation with their husband or wife is, are we raising our sons and daughters differently,
Mhm.
and why? What specific things do we feel like it's important that our sons learn, that our daughters learn, that they both learn,
Right.
right? And what expectations are we putting on our sons, our daughters, or society is putting on our sons and our daughters that's going to make their trajectory to follow and fulfill their biblical roles difficult?
Yeah, this is definitely not a popular opinion, and it's one that you're gonna have to stand up to some criticism to raise your kids this way, and then your kids may have to stand up to some critiquing or criticism of their life choices. But I think it's one that is essential to setting up the next generation to raise biblical households as well. So we're on a trajectory to raise households that serve the Lord. And I pray that our journey is encouraging to yours. We love you guys, and we'll see you next time.